Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome back to our session this afternoon. And this session is on HR risk management and data analysis. My name is Andrew Ondari. Risk and risk management has become a very important aspect in the management of our human resources in organizations. By definition, a risk is anything in our environment that has a potential of causing losses, harm, or damage to company property, or loss of employees. For that reason, we need to ensure that we mitigate the effects of these risks so that organizations can survive and compete in the market. Risk management, on the other hand, is a process. It is a process of identifying, analyzing, prioritizing, selecting, implementing, and reviewing risk management strategies. Risk identification, as I will mention, is a process of pointing out or a process of establishing the types of risks that may arise in the management of human resources. In almost every activity that we perform in HR, there are risks. Starting with the recruitment, there are recruitment risks. Training, there are training risks. Performance management, they also exist there. Employee relations risks also exist. So this afternoon, we are going to look at what risks are, types of risks, process of managing risks, and how we can effectively mitigate the impact of the risks. On the other hand, data analysis is also an important element in human resource audit. Once data has been collected, it should be analyzed and interpreted. There are various types of data that we'll be analyzing. One, quantitative data, and two, qualitative data. And we will be looking at various tools that we can use to analyze data. Why do we need data analysis? It is for purposes of decision making related to the various HR functions which we will have audited. This morning, we looked at auditing the HR function. And this afternoon, we are going to look at some of the risks that may arise from the functional audits. And then once we conduct the audit, we will create data, analyze it, interpret it, and then use it for decision making. In this topic, there are various themes that we are going to look at. These are the subtopics within that unit. And there are three. One, risk identification and prioritization. It is important for us to know what types of risks that may arise in auditing the HR function. And once we identify them, we will analyze, in terms of causes and effects, as well as impact. Then after that, we can prioritize. As we shall see, prioritization is based on likelihood of the risk happening and to the impact. And perhaps we shall look at a matrix showing how prioritization can be done. Secondly, we are going to look at data gathering and analysis as part of the human audit. When we are auditing the HR functions or any other form or type of audit, we will be collecting data. We will collect data using various tools or methods, such as interviews, observations, questionnaires, as well as focus groups. This data will then be analyzed, one, to identify trends. So we can do a trend analysis. And based on these trends, we will be able to predict the outcomes of certain activities that we engage in. And based on that, we are able to make a decision or a forecast future activities, particularly in human resource planning. And then lastly, we will create an audit matrix that shows the areas that we will have audited, the gaps that we have identified, the risks that arise, the people responsible, the recommendations, the timelines, as well as the resources required. So that when we look at this matrix at a glance, we are able to see the areas that we have audited, the risks that arise from those areas, the action plans based on the risks, and then the people responsible and timelines. So we will start with the risk identification and prioritization part. Risk identification refers to the process of highlighting threats and the areas in which these threats may arise. So we can define it as a process of recognizing risks related to human resources. As I said, a risk is a threat, and therefore risk identification means recognizing the threats that affect the effective functioning of the human resource department. And these risks affect the management of people in many ways. One, they might lead to poor performance of employees. Two, they might lead to loss of money. And three, they might lead to loss of customers. And therefore, as I said earlier, a risk is anything in our environment, particularly related to HR, that may cause losses. Losses of customers, losses of employees, and even losses of property. Or it can be damage to company property. Or it might be harm, anything that may cause harm to human life. For example, something that may cause diseases or injury, that is harm. And we will be looking at some of these risks and how they are manifested. The purpose of conducting risk identification and prioritization is to ensure that we address issues before they balloon to become a crisis. That means that efforts should be made to ensure that once the risks have been identified, they are addressed immediately before they become bigger. If risks are not addressed immediately, and depending on their impact, they will soon escalate to be a crisis. And as HR managers, we are not crisis managers. We are proactive people. And when we are proactive, we are able to identify issues in advance and take appropriate measures. Another aspect is the focus. What is the focus of risk identification and prioritization? The focus is on the HR functions, as I have highlighted there, one of which is recruitment. So we will be looking at what risks recruitment and selection. For example, selecting low quality employee. That is a risk. And I will explain how that is a risk and what needs to be done in order to address that risk. The other focus area is the payroll. We allocate funds for purposes of paying our employees. And a lot of money is spent on compensation and benefits. Errors may arise in the payroll, that is inaccurate calculations, for example. This may lead to loss of money. Companies have lost money because of errors in their payroll. Before they realize it, either employees have left or even died, God forbid, and that becomes a liability to the organization. The other area is training, and we will look at the risks that arise from training. For example, we train a person on certain core skills that we need, but soon after the training, they exit the organization. That is a loss and it's a risk because we have spent money and that the employee has not stayed long enough for him or her to deliver services to recover the costs. So another focus area, therefore, is training. Another one is benefits, which is also related to compensation. The benefits that we give our employees, such as health benefits, like medical cover. These benefits can be abused, and that becomes a risk. Or we can allocate money for certain benefits, and yet they are not being utilized. How is that a risk? It is because money is kept somewhere and it's not being utilized to generate revenue for the organization. Another area is workplace safety, where we need to ensure that our employees are safe or the workplace is free from accidents. We all know that there are risks associated with workplace safety, where accidents are common. The risk arising from this accident is the loss of productivity and the compensation of the injured employees. And lastly is compliance. All the areas of HR have compliance issues, be it recruitment, there is a compliance issue. Payroll, there is a compliance issue, training, and others. Compliance with what? Compliance with three things. One, the labor law. Two, organizational policy. And three, industry standards. So as we move ahead with this program, we shall be focusing on some of the risks that arise from these areas I've mentioned. The importance of risk identification is to ensure that the workplace is sustainable. Sustainability arises from two things. One, that the organization is able to survive crisis, that is resilience. That if we can manage our risks effectively, then we make our organizations resilient. Secondly, sustainability can arise out of continuous existence of the organization, continuous existence. That if the risks are not managed well, the organization may collapse. For example, in all the areas of focus, we may find there are so many risks. If these risks become too many, for example, exit of all employees, the organization may close down. Workplace safety, if the place is very unsafe, employees exit and we cannot attract any other person, the organization closes. On compliance, if the organization does not comply with certain health and safety standards, then the government might close it or any other agency authorized to supervise or even regulate that workplace. Lastly, there must be alignment. This is the linkage between HR risks and organizational goals. If there are risks that exist, they affect organizational goals. For example, employee turnover affects the attainment of goals. How does this happen? That employees leave and therefore there is nobody to perform their tasks. And the goal of the organization was to enhance customer satisfaction. If employees have left, the remaining employees could be well overwhelmed and the customer dissatisfaction results in this process, which is against the goal of the organization. So ladies and gentlemen, that is our highlight on risk identification and prioritization. What are the common HR risks that may exist in our workplace? I've mentioned some of them, but it doesn't break a bone to go over them again. One is the compliance risks. We have to comply with the labor laws, with the contracts, and workplace safety. What are the risks that are associated with non-compliance? I'll mention three. One, lawsuits. That in recruitment, in training, and performance management, if the process is against the law, then somebody can go to court and sue the organization. How is it a risk? It is because time and money is spent in the labor courts when employees should be working. And that results in loss of productivity. Another risk is fines. when we do not obey the law, the court may be fining the employees or even the employers. Those fines can be hefty. For example, on data security, if you look at the last bullet, the law says under the Data Protection Act that a data controller who contravenes privacy and confidentiality of records is guilty of an offense and can be fined up to 5 million shillings. Fine, 5 million shillings. Or 1% of the total revenues. These fines are very high, and for some organizations, especially small ones, they may close, and that becomes a risk. The other compliance risk is penalties, where we can be asked, for example, to compensate employees for work not done. How can this arise? That an employee is dismissed on account of poor performance, for example, and the employee goes to court, and the court says that the employee is not guilty, and gives an award of compensation. The employees are compensated for work not done. And that is a risk because there is money spent and there is no value for it. So that is one common risk arising from legal compliance. Secondly, there is the recruitment risks. These are in the form of biasness, poor screening, and talent misalignment. Allow me to talk about each of them one by one. Bias. Under the Employment Act, everybody who is qualified has an equal opportunity to be employed. But when recruiters are biased, for example, based on religion, disability, or color or ethnic background, the employee might go to court and sue that organization. If found guilty, the organization can pay the employee for time wasted or even force the organization to conduct the recruitment and selection process afresh. And that is a loss of time and money because of biased decisions made by the recruiters. This does not only happen to new employees, it can also happen to existing employees when they are being discriminated against, especially during promotions. If somebody feels that they should be promoted and they merit promotion, they can sue the organization for biasness. Secondly is poor screening. At the end of a recruitment process, we expect to get the best candidate. Screening starts at the time of shortlisting. Shortlisting can be done manually using human resources or digitally using automated systems. If we use automated system, we are likely to be more accurate in our screening. But if we use manual means, And because of the large number of applications, humans are likely to miss out on a qualified candidate who could have been allowed to work in the organization. Secondly, screening can happen during interviews. What can happen in the interviews that may lead to a poor selection? One, the interview questions. Either they are too simple or too complicated that the potential employees do not understand. Two, the recruiters or recruiting panel is not qualified in the recruitment or in the interview process. So they end up selecting a wrong person. Another aspect of poor screening is when we do not check the background of the employees. One, in terms of their record in performance, or two, in terms of their qualifications. Qualifications have to do with the certificates they hold and from which institutions. If we do not screen the employees on their background, either in terms of performance or academic qualifications, then we end up bringing on board the wrong person. And when you hire the wrong person, there are consequences. One, we shall have wasted money in hiring this person. Two, the person does not perform the job for which they were hired. And three, the employee might leave the organization because they were not adequately qualified to do that job. So poor screening is a risk that may lead to loss of money, loss of brand image, and even poor performance. Then lastly is talent misalignment. This happens especially when we are assigning duties to the employees who have been recruited. This assignment is what you call employee placement. If employees are not placed in the right jobs, then there is misalignment. That suggests that the employees are given jobs for which they are not qualified. For example, a HR officer is now placed in the ICT department. The functions of ICT and HR are different. The skills and knowledge required are different. So if for some strange reason, a person is placed in the wrong job, then there is misalignment. And this is a complete waste of talent because the person cannot perform and that the organization cannot achieve its objectives because the person doesn't perform. So recruitment risks revolve around poor bias, poor screening, and talent misalignment. There are other risks associated with the recruitment, such as poor onboarding, that we might bring on board a good employee, but if we mismanage the onboarding process, the employee might leave soon after. That whatever they go through, the experience they get in onboarding may affect their decision to leave or stay in the organization. If they leave because of poor onboarding, then that becomes a risk, which is part of recruitment and selection. The third common risk is compensation. Compensation is expected to achieve certain objectives. One, motivate employees to perform better, and two, to retain them. However, if the payment system is inequitable, this is likely to discourage employees and they might leave or perform poorly. And that is the risk of inequitable payment. Payroll errors, such as miscalculations of payment or benefits that employees should get. This is a risk because employees will be paid money that they don't deserve. In some cases, recovering the money from them is very difficult, and that is because of payroll errors. Tax violations. There are various taxes associated with payment. And one of the most common tax is pay as you earn, payee. Employers are expected to deduct this tax and remit to KRA. Failure to do so is a violation of the Employment Act. And this might lead to capturing of the accounts of an organization until they pay. As we speak, I'm sure there are many organizations that are in violation of payee as a tax. And this comes with penalties. When KRA captures your account, it can cripple all your operations. And it may take a long time to negotiate with KRA for them to release those accounts. So to be on the safe side, we are expected to comply with this legal requirement of remitting payee to KRA. Another common risk is employee relations risks, which relate to grievances, harassment, conflict, and mismanagement. Grievances are complaints, and if they are not addressed properly, they might become or escalate to become disputes. It is better to address these complaints early enough. There is a tendency of managers ignoring complaints from individuals. Sooner or later, 2 more people will be complaining, then 10, then 20, then 100, then it becomes an organizational crisis. Just because we ignored the small grievance that was presented by an individual employee. And these grievances can affect the operations of the organization as well as its reputation. Harassment, by definition, is any unwelcome advances against any member of the organization. Any member, it could be male or female. It is expected that we have a harassment policy. And this policy should clearly define what amounts to harassment. When employees feel harassed, they can report to the management. And if this issue is not addressed, it may escalate to become a crisis. The union might take over and then it becomes a conflict or a dispute. Or an employee can go to court and sue the individual employees or the organization for abetting harassment. If they have evidence, then again that becomes a risk because the image of an organization is at stake. Many of us could be afraid of joining or working with them if there are reported cases of harassment, either at the lower levels, sorry, or at higher levels. Harassment in all its forms is a negative aspect and can become a risk. Conflicts are differences between employees and employers, differences. Unless they are addressed again, it might become a serious issue because conflicts like the one that we witnessed in the last 2-3 weeks relating to university strike is a risk. I'm trying to imagine the number of students who have been affected because of the strikes, the lecturer strike, which means that there was a conflict that was not resolved. When such things happen, performance is affected. The lecturers are not working. They are not performing. The students are idle, and probably the universities will be closed. I hear the doctors have already started beating drums of war. They want to go on strike. Why? Because of a conflict between them and the employers. So this is another risk because when there is a strike, it means there is work stoppage and that the organization is not generating revenue as it should. Another common risk is related to performance. Performance management revolves around planning, appraisals, and monitoring of employee performance on a regular basis. So what are the risks associated with performance? One is inconsistent appraisals. Inconsistency may arise from several sources. One, the assessment criteria or standard, meaning that there is no standard criteria for evaluating employees. And this becomes inconsistent. Secondly, inconsistency may arise from the frequency of appraisals. From a policy perspective, appraisals are meant to be undertaken either quarterly, biannually, or annually. For some organizations, they can conduct this randomly. That means they are inconsistent. And this might be due to poor management or leadership in those organizations. That employees or managers can conduct appraisals at any time they wish, which is against their policy. And then lastly, appraisals may arise from, inconsistent appraisals may arise from the ratings that we use to assess employees. For example, this year we might use merit rating. Next year we use ranking method. And another year we don't use anything. That becomes inconsistent. And for that reason, we need to have a clear policy on performance appraisal related to, one, the method of appraisal, two, the criteria for appraisal, three, the timelines for appraisal, which relates to frequency, and lastly, to the procedures of appraisals so that we are consistent. Otherwise, inconsistencies may lead to poor performance, dissatisfaction, and eventually loss of employees through turnover. Performance risks also relate to low productivity, where employees are not performing to the expected standards. And this can happen if, one, there are no clear objectives of appraisal. Two, there are no clear KPIs for assessment. Three, employees are not given adequate time to perform their tasks. And four, there is biasness in performance evaluations. All this lead to low productivity, meaning that the organization cannot achieve its objectives. Lastly is the skill gap. There must be a linkage between performance and training. Training is a process of equipping people with skills and knowledge in order to perform, keyword there, perform their jobs or roles effectively. Through performance appraisals, managers are able to identify performance gaps. These performance gaps can be bridged through the following. One, allocation of resources. Two, redeployment of employees. Three, motivation. And lastly, training. If the performance gap is as a result of lack of skills and knowledge, then employees should be trained. So that is the linkage between skill gaps identified through performance and the training intervention. Lastly is data security, as provided for in the Data Protection Act 2019. Privacy and confidentiality of employee records should be ensured at all times. If there is a breach of this confidentiality and privacy, two things might happen. One, the employee might go to the Office of the Data Protection Commission and launch a complaint. The Office of the Data Protection Commission might have to visit the organization and have a conversation as to why there was that breach. And again, if found guilty, there could be a penalty of 5 million shillings, depending on the size of the organization, or 1% of the total revenues. That is a cost to the organization related to data security. Or secondly, an employee can go to court and sue the employee. And again, the same thing can happen for data breach. There could be fines. So we should be careful when we are handling data as organizations because we are data handlers. What are the sources of risks? I have categorized them into several groups. One is internal sources related to poor policies, mismanagement, and weak HR information systems. Poor policies relate to gaps in our policies which do not address adequately the issues in organizations. When policies are not comprehensive enough or they are not complete, then they become a source of risk. Because policies are supposed to be in compliance with the labor laws, poor policies therefore may lead to compliance risks. And this is an internal source. Secondly is mismanagement. Management revolves around 4 or 5 key aspects or functions. 1, planning. 2, organizing. 3, directing. And 4, controlling organizational resources. Mismanagement can arise from poor planning. It can also arise from disorganization. It may also relate to poor controls. For example, controls in terms of financial management. If there are no effective controls, then organizations might lose money, which is a risk. Managers can mismanage resources and even people because of 2 things. 1, lack of sufficient training. 2 is lack of experience. And in some cases is impunity. So those 3 causes, those 3 factors can lead to mismanagement. Lack of training, lack of experience, and impunity. How does mismanagement affect the organization? 1, loss of money. 2, loss of employees through turnover. And 3, loss of revenue. Those are risks that relate to management. Lastly, on internal sources is weak information systems. A HR information system contains several elements, particularly employee records, records related to promotion, records related to transfer, records related to discipline, records related to performance, among others. So a weak system may not have all these records, including promotion and even turnover. Because of these poor records, we may lose our employees, which is a risk. Or performance may be affected because we don't have a reference to make to. Or information may be leaked, which may be in breach of the Data Protection Act. So those are some of the internal sources of risks. And when we are auditing, we will look at whether the policies are adequate in terms of comprehensiveness and clarity, whether there is proper management of human and financial resources, and then whether the data we have in our information systems is adequately protected, is complete, and is comprehensive. Thirdly, or rather secondly, is external sources. These are risks outside the organization, which in many cases are beyond the control of managers. What organizations can only do is to adapt to changes in this environment. I have given 3 examples. One, changes in labor laws, like the introduction of SHA. There's nothing managers or organizations can do about it except to comply. What is the risk? It is the requirements of this law. For example, if you do not remit the deductions from the employees by the 9th of every month, there is a penalty, which means that you pay extra money, which becomes a risk to the organization because that is a loss. Secondly, in relation to labor laws is compliance. Certain labor laws require money. They also require people, and others require time. And because of that, some organizations may not comply, and the law enforcement authorities may come down on us because of non-compliance. Becomes a risk. Economic downturns. For the last few years, for example, Kenya has been experiencing an economic downturn that organizations are not performing in terms of revenues. Individuals are not able to meet their or pay their bills because of low income. Business people, including those selling merchandise on the roadside, they are not getting enough money to spend. And because of that, organizations may be affected. All organizations are affected during an economic downturn. That means that there is no disposable income for everybody to spend. For instance, those of us in the manufacturing industry, because customers do not have the purchasing power, the revenues may come down as well as the profits. And when this happens, the organizations may opt to downsize or even close. These are risks because during closure of organizations or during downsizing, some top talents may leave the organization, and that affects their performance. Lastly are political factors. Political factors may fall into 3 categories. One is declarations by politicians, including the president. Those declarations affect the operations of an organization. Or it could be a negative statement made by a politician about an organization. Because they hold positions of power, these politicians are opinion makers and shapers. If they talk negatively about the organization, this might affect the employment practices or even damage the reputation of the organization. So that is one, political statements by politicians. Secondly, political factors also include regulations. Government, through its various agencies, develop regulations to manage various sectors of the economy. And these regulations, for example, payment of certain levies may affect the operations of an organization. What are the examples? One is Kenya Power, and two is the Energy Petroleum Regulatory Authority, EPRA. When they adjust their prices, it affects the revenues of the organization. And when revenues go down, the salaries of employees may be affected. Either the salaries are negotiated downwards or stopped because employers cannot afford that. So that becomes another risk. Another source of risk is human factors, both within and outside, one of which is negligence. Negligence refers to avoidance of doing a task or a job which an employee was supposed to do. This falls under gross misconduct, that if an employee does not perform a task which he or she was supposed to do, then that becomes negligence as compared to carelessness. Carelessness can be forgiven, but negligence is willful avoidance of work which somebody was supposed to do. And through this negligence, several things can happen. One, accidents. That because somebody avoided work, an accident occurred. For example, a driver of a truck, he or she was supposed to park it properly in the yard and then negligently does not do that. It rolls backwards, kills a person, or destroys a property. That is negligence. And that is a risk because property has been damaged or a life has been lost. Another human factor is absenteeism. Being absent once or twice is not a serious offense, but if it is repetitive, it becomes a gross misconduct. When employees absent themselves from work, it means that nobody is doing their work, or if somebody is doing it, then they are overworked. This absenteeism should be addressed because it can lead to certain consequences. The other human factor is low morale. When employees are not motivated, they don't perform well. And in many cases, they exit the organization and that becomes turnover. Lastly is workplace conflicts, especially between unions and employers. If these conflicts are not addressed, several things happen. One, there is loss of brand image or reputation. And two, employee exits, among other consequences. Lastly, or second last, is failure of technologies. Though we are embracing technologies, it has its own weaknesses. Some technologies may fail, which may lead to disruption of processes. Technology is not 100% reliable. These downtimes may result from one, lack of electric energy or power. Two, breakdowns of machines. Or three, especially in software, in viruses, infection of viruses. This can cause damage to the organization. I am aware of an organization whose systems were hacked, and to date, they have never recovered because they lost almost everything. All the data was corrupted or lost, which means that technology is vulnerable or puts the organization in a vulnerable position. And those breakdowns or downtimes cause disruptions. For example, in payroll, to recruitment, if you are using ATS, 3, training and development, if you are using LMS, 4, in performance management, if you are using 360-degree Microsoft. All these are technologies which can fail. But we should not run away from this because of failures. We should always be ready with interventions to ensure that these failures do not affect us. Lastly is market dynamics, where there are many changes in the environment in which we operate. In labor economics, you talk about demand and supply. Demand for adequate skills and knowledge, and also supply of the same. If demand for labor is high, it means that there are shortages of certain skills. For example, today in the health sector, particularly hospitals, we do not have enough doctors, particularly neurosurgeons. This shortage affects operations of hospitals, and that is why some doctors have to be shared among many hospitals, because these are consultants who are not readily available in the market. In the ICT sector, we do not have adequate personnel, particularly in data science, and that is a shortage. All these shortages affect operations like recruitment and talent retention. In recruitment, we might find it expensive to hire these skills that are in short supply. In talent retention, because of the high demand, employees are fairly mobile and we lose them through turnover. So these are some of the sources of risks in human resource management. And as auditors, we should be able to identify these risks and suggest remedial or mitigation measures. Before we take a small break for questions, how do we identify risks? Several techniques can be used. One, brainstorming, is where people from different sectors and departments are brought together to discuss an issue. These discussions may be based on their own personal experience or training. So the team discusses all the possible risks. Secondly, we can interview people so that we can get their insights on what they experience in the organization. We can interview people on staff welfare, recruitment, and retention challenges. Staff welfare has to do with the well-being of the employee, and it may be related to several aspects, like mental health, like health services like medical cover, as well as counseling. These wellness programs may also have something to do with risks. So we can interview people relating to all the possible sources of risks and we can get insights from them. Another technique is surveys. These are questionnaires that we design, give them to our employees or people outside, and they can give us feedback. They can highlight issues in the workplace that may be of concern to everybody. Another technique is use of checklists or templates. A checklist is a list of items where the auditors can tick the boxes. For example, in recruitment, we can list all the possible risks. In training, we can list all of them, and in all other functions. So through a checklist, we are able to identify the risks that relate to human resource functions. And lastly, SWOT analysis. SWOT analysis is a tool that is used in strategy. This analysis is derived from environmental analysis. That when we analyze an environment, we look at two types of environment. One, internal environment, and two, external environment. When we analyze the internal environment, we are likely to identify strengths and weaknesses. Strengths are areas in which we are doing well comparatively or we are good at. Weaknesses are areas in which we have vulnerabilities which can affect our operations. Those weaknesses may be pointers to risks. And then an analysis of the external environment, which might be political, economic, social, and technological, will help us to identify opportunities and threats. That changes in that environment, which we call PESTEL, can present opportunities. For example, changes in technology can present an opportunity. For example, today we are talking about software development, data analytics, or AI. That when such a technology comes into the market, it becomes an opportunity for us to improve or even do better. That technology can also become a threat, especially if we are not able to adapt to that technology. Why can't we adapt to such technologies is because of the financial implications. It could be expensive to buy that technology, or we do not have trained staff to manage the technology. So two things come out there in terms of risks: weaknesses, which relate to internal vulnerabilities, and threats, which arise from changes in the external environment. And from this, we can therefore develop strategies, especially on risk management. If we have weaknesses, we should find a way of converting them into threats, and if rather into strengths. And if there are many threats, we should be able to identify strategies to mitigate their effects, mitigate, reduce. And therefore, on that note, I want to stop there briefly and invite questions from all of us and any comments that you may have. Allow me to go back to where we started, that is risk identification. What is it? The purpose and the linkage to organizational goals. 2, the common HR risks, which I discussed. 3, sources of risks. And lastly, risk identification techniques. Anybody with a question or a comment to make, please go ahead. From my end, I can see Frida, Ekiru, and Charles. Any one of us can ask a question. Alice, Emmanuel, and Benjamin, if you have a question, please ask or make a comment. Alice, if you can go first. All right, Emmanuel. Thank you. In case you want to have a clear understanding of what I'm discussing today, this is a kind reminder that we have a training on the 20th to 25th of this month at the Nairobi Safari Club, where we shall be discussing in detail human resource audit, and you are encouraged to attend so that you can have a deep understanding of this. And at the successful completion of that course, you will get a certified human auditor's certificate, which you can use in your CV, or you can also use as a consultant to audit other organizations or to audit your own organization. I repeat, we have a training on the 20th to 25th of this month, October, at the Nairobi Safari Club, where we will be discussing in detail HR audit, and this training will lead to the acquisition of a certified human resource auditor certificate. Moving forward, we want to look at the tools that we can use to identify risks. Probably from our end, we have several tools that we can use. I have 5 of the tools here. One is risk registers. This is basically a checklist of all the possible risks in all the areas of HR. A checklist in recruitment and selection, a checklist in training and development, a checklist in performance management, a checklist in compensation, among other areas. To identify those risks and prioritize them. Very easy to identify and prioritize them. And 2, it is very easy to look for mitigation or develop mitigation measures because they are specific. For example, in recruitment, we list all the risks. And what are some of the risks is poor recruitment process or non-alignment with the labor laws. And if we feel that these are priority, then we can prioritize and develop mitigation measures in each of those listed risks. Very easy, instead of having all the risks which do not relate to a particular area. So in risk registers, we identify the areas like recruitment, training, performance management. And then in the next column, we list the risks that may arise. And then the next column, we might identify mitigation measures. Secondly, we can have flow charts. Because human resource management is basically process-based, we can create a flow chart of all the processes that are involved. For instance, recruitment is a process, training is a process, performance management is a process, disciplinary procedure is a process. So we can create a flow chart which shows the step-by-step method of conducting these activities. And in each of the steps, we identify risks. For example, in training, the first step in training is conducting a training needs assessment. In that process, we identify gaps or risks. The second step in training is to design a training program. And in that step, we identify gaps or risks. The third step in training is to develop the training materials. Again, we identify gaps. The fourth step in training is implementing the training by allocating resources and monitoring progress. We again identify gaps. And lastly, step 5 is evaluating the training as the last step. And what are the gaps, or what do we evaluate? In the evaluation of training, we assess several things like results, 2, behaviors, and 3, transfer of learning. And if there are weaknesses in any of these areas, we should be able to pick them out. So flowcharts are another way of identifying risks or gaps. The third tool is cause and effect diagrams. That everything that happens in an organization has a cause. If it is poor performance, there is a cause. If it's employee turnover, there is a cause. If there is lawsuits or there are lawsuits, there is a cause. There must be a relationship between the issues happening now and what is causing them. And for us to identify the causes, we might use certain tools or methods. The most common methods of cause and effect relationship are: 1, the fishbone, mfupa ya samaki, where the head shows the problem and the bones show the potential causes. And we can work backwards until we get the root cause of the problem. For example, turnover is a problem. So we look at the root causes using the fishbone. One of the causes is poor work environment. Another fishbone is poor management. Another fishbone is poor compensation. Another fishbone is poor placement. And then we try to link all these causes to turnover. The second diagram is the 5 whys. 5 whys. The word why is WHY. For example, we ask in relation to turnover. There is turnover, which is a problem. We ask why. When we get an answer, we ask another why. Then we ask another why until the 5th why. That 5th why can no longer be broken down. That becomes the root cause of turnover. Then another tool is scenario analysis, where we are looking at the possible changes in our environment, or outcomes. For example, layoffs. Layoffs may happen because of a poor economic performance of an organization, where employees have to be declared redundant. So we look at the effect. What could be the effect of such layoffs? One scenario is that there will be overworking of the remaining employees. Two, another scenario could be employee demotivation. Three, another scenario is turnover. Another scenario could be poor employee performance. Another scenario could be poor reputation, that this is a dying organization. So scenario analysis looks at the effects of certain actions within an organization, such as layoffs. During strikes, we also look at several scenarios. Work stoppage is one of them. Employee exit after the strike is another one. Disciplinary action for participating in an illegal strike is another one. So several scenarios can be used to identify risks. And then lastly is benchmarking, where we are doing a comparison between our own practices within and those of other organizations in the industry. Why do we do that? We want to identify best practices for purposes of improvement. We can also benchmark based on the experiences of others. That some organizations that have gone through a similar experience can tell us whether it was a risk or not, and see how they managed their risks. So using the experiences of others, especially the experience of failure, able to identify risks. Stakeholder involvement in risk auditing is very important. There are many stakeholders in an organization. The key ones are employers and employees. These are the two players in an organization. In some cases, we can also bring other stakeholders, for example, government agencies like the labor officers. If not, we can also bring the industrial court, especially on matters arbitration where there are disputes. So we can engage all these stakeholders to identify risks. And what is the purpose of this stakeholder engagement? One is collaboration. That through this involvement, we are able to share responsibilities in case of negative consequences. In an organizational setting, the stakeholders are employees or the union and the managers. That we bring them on board to identify risks related to employment practices and look for solutions. In case we don't succeed, there is shared responsibility that we want in this, all of us. Secondly, involvement ensures ownership. That all those that were involved own the decisions that are made with respect to risks. So we are all accountable when it comes to risk management. For HR, for example, we are the owners of risks related to recruitment, training, performance management. In finance, the finance manager is the owner of the risks related to revenues, investments, and profits. In ICT, the owners of the risks are the ICT managers in relation to data protection and flow of data within the organization. That ownership is important because we share responsibility for what is happening. 3 is communication, that when we involve others, we create awareness of the risks that are likely to happen so that people know what steps need to be taken. Another importance of stakeholder involvement is transparency. That through risk identification, we are putting everything on the table. All the cards are open for discussion. And that promotes transparency so that there is nobody who will point a finger at any other person for failing, because everything was done above board and everything was discussed. So if there is anybody to blame, it is all of us. Another benefit is accountability, which relates to the second point of ownership. So we are accountable for the risks that happen and their management. So all the people involved in the risk management are accountable for, 1, identifying the risks, 2, developing alternative measures to mitigate, 3, prioritizing, and 4, implementing the options for mitigation. So accountability has to do with being responsible for what happens in risk management. Then there is the risk prioritization. Prioritization means that we consider certain risks to be the first or second or last. When a risk is prioritized, it means all the attention and resources are directed towards its mitigation. And therefore, what are the criteria for risk prioritization? 1 is likelihood of happening. And for us to do that, we need to identify trends showing how often those risks happen. If they happen regularly, then the likelihood is high. Secondly, we look at the impact. What is the severity of that impact? That is the damage on reputation or finances of the organization or loss of property. The impact can either be low, average, or moderate, or low. 3 levels: 1, high, 2, moderate, and 3, low. So that when we prioritize, we look at those that have a high impact. First, we consider how often, and then we look at the impact. If the risk happens regularly and the impact is high, then we should prioritize that. Thirdly, another criterion is control strength. This shows the capacity of an organization to mitigate the effect. And the control measures, for example, in data protection, include levels of authorization, 2, firewalls, and 3, cloud computing. So if we do not have any of this, then we are exposed. And because of that exposure, the risk is very high because we do not have capacity to manage that risk. Another criterion is urgency, meaning the promptness of the action to be taken. Some actions must be taken now. Others might be taken soon, and others might be taken later. If the likelihood is high, if the impact is high, if the control strength is low, then the action is immediate. There is no waiting time. A solution has to be found to mitigate the impact. Then another criterion is cost of inaction, meaning what will happen if we don't do anything. And again, this will depend on the likelihood, the impact, control strength, and urgency. If the likelihood is low, if the impact is low, if there are inadequate control measures, then even if we do not do anything, nothing changes, and therefore we are safe. However, we should monitor, even if the likelihood and the impacts are very low. We should always monitor because some of the things we consider to be less impact might spiral to be of a monumental proportion tomorrow if nothing is taken or if they are not monitored. Just like in our vehicles, those of us who have vehicles, if you hear a rattling sound from under your engine, you can choose to ignore that. That's lack of action. Or you can choose to take a step. Or you can see a light on your dashboard showing check engine. If you ignore that, you know the consequences. So you look at the cost of doing nothing against the cost of doing something. So if you see a yellow light showing engine check, you must know that there is something serious with your engine, either with your gearbox or with your compression. And you must take action immediately. That is the same case that happens to the organization. Sometimes an employee may exit, one employee after some time. You can ignore that. But if the number of exits increase, the cost of inaction can be very high. Because sooner or later, all the employees will have bolted and you will be remaining with an empty sty. That suggests that you don't close a sty after all the horses have bolted. What's the need? There's no horse remaining in the sty. So if all employees have left, they're taking corrective measures because everything has crumbled. Lastly is relevance in terms of legal compliance. All laws must be obeyed, however small they may look. Non-compliance has its own risks. So if we don't comply, there are those risks like penalties, fines, and even lawsuits. We should be careful to ensure that all those legal requirements are addressed. Before we take another break for questions, we now look at risk reporting and action. That after we have identified the risks, we have known their impact, we have prioritized, then it is now time to report the risks and develop action plans. allow me to take us back to risk management, where I said that this is a process. I will mention several steps that are involved in risk management. One, risk identification, which we have done. Two, risk analysis by looking at the cause and effect. Three, risk prioritization by looking at which risks must be addressed first. Four is selection or identification of action plans. This is where we are. We have identified the risks, we have analyzed the risks, we have prioritized, and therefore it's time for reporting and taking action. So what are the tools that we can use to ensure that we have reported the risks and taken actions? One, we use the risk register, where we have a risk in all the areas of HR. Recruitment, we have identified the risks and the priorities. Secondly, in recruitment, in training rather, we have identified the risks and prioritized. In compensation, we have identified the risks and prioritized. So we have a risk register for all the HR functions. And in case we are asked to present our risks to the risk managers in our organization, we already have this register showing one, the areas of HR, two, the risks that may arise, three, the sources of the risks, four, the risk measures, and five, the action plan. So a risk register is not just a list of risks, but consists of a number of aspects like the area of risk, the types of risks, the impact of the risks, the mitigation measures. Secondly, we can use heat maps. Heat maps, this is a template, a two-sided template which shows the likelihood of a risk taking place against the impact. So on one side, there is the likelihood, and on the other side, there is the impact. And in each of the cells, we can either say high, average, or low. If the likelihood is high, the impact is high, then we can color code that as red, because that requires immediate action. And we are reporting that this is an area that requires urgent attention. And if the impact is moderate and the likelihood is moderate, then we can color code that as amber or yellow, if you may. That this is a risk that is under watch. And then lastly, where the likelihood is very low and the impact is very low, then we can color code that green, meaning that we can ignore or we can do nothing because the impact is low and the likelihood is low. So we do not have to fear anything. So there are three color codes in this heat map: one red, two amber, and three green, just like in a traffic roundabout or junction. Red means danger, means that action must be taken to stop. Amber, we are getting ready, it can either turn red or turn green. So we should be careful. And the green, we are safe, and therefore the impact is low and the likelihood is low. That is a heat map. Another way of reporting is through audit dashboard. In our systems, particularly ERPs or HRIS, we may have dashboards embedded in them. So this dashboard will ask people to give their comments, or a report may be posted here for all the other managers or employees to see. Dashboard. The beauty with the dashboards is that they can be viewed in real time, so that action can also be taken in real time. So depending on the levels of authorization, a dashboard serves as a very important source of reporting and action planning. Another way of reporting is attending those management briefings where the HR manager can present a report on the risks that are likely to take place within the HR function. So the manager can highlight the risks and share with other managers for their attention. Another way of reporting is development of action plans, where we are creating or developing targeted responses in terms of priority. And in this case, we should identify one, perhaps we can create a template. This template consists of several columns and rows. Column one could be an area, and this area is like recruitment and selection. The second column could be the risk. What is the risk that is likely to arise from recruitment? The third column is the action plan. What actions should be taken in order of priority against those risks? The third column could be the person responsible. Who should be responsible for implementing that action plan? The fifth column could be resources required, and the last column is the timelines. In terms of timelines, those high priority risks should be acted upon immediately. So we cannot say the third quarter of this year or the last quarter. If something is urgent, it should be done immediately because we have prioritized it. Lastly is the review cycle, that every year we do an audit of our HR function, and these audits can identify risks, and we can report these risks during the annual review. If we can do it quarterly, that is another option, or biannually. So ladies and gentlemen, those are the ways in which we can report risks and take actions. Before we go to the second part, again, I want to ask for any questions or comments related to risk identification techniques, to risk identification tools, 3, stakeholder involvement, 4, risk prioritization, and last, risk reporting. So the floor is ours. If you have a question or a comment to make, please go ahead. Ekiru, if you are there, please ask a question or make a comment. Alice Luangu. Any comment or question that you may have? Benjamin?
I'm very satisfied, Malim. This is very well. Your today highlights is very insightful, and I think we've learned a lot. We see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Benjamin, and I'm happy that you are enjoying this program. So if there is no other question or comment, we can move to the next part. That is part 2 of our risk management and data analysis. So the second part is data gathering and analysis. The first part was risk prioritization, risk identification and prioritization. So the second part is data gathering. Data gathering, as the word suggests, is collecting data for analysis. Remember, we started with 1, an introduction to HR audit. 2, we looked at the compliance aspect of data HR audit. And today we have been looking at auditing the HR functions and also risk management. During audit, we will collect data because auditing requires that you review policies, you review practices, you review processes, and you review systems. This reviews requires that we document our findings. So data will give us the findings of our audit. So what is the concept of data gathering? It is about assembling all the information related to HR function in terms of compliance, efficiency, and performance. Secondly, the purpose of data gathering is to ensure that HR audit findings are factual and reliable. Factual because they reflect the reality on the ground, and therefore they are accurate. Reliable because they are consistent. So when we are doing reporting, which we will talk about tomorrow, reliability will only be determined if there is consistency in the tools that we use in data gathering. And we are going to look at some of the tools that we use in HR audit. The focus of data gathering is HR policy, so we'll have to document this. Payrolls, recruitment, training, and employee records. This is where we are going to collect data from, because HR audit revolves around all these things. Then what is the importance? of gathering and analyzing data? It is because we want to make decisions based on evidence. And the evidence here is data. This data must be valid and must be reliable. So through data gathering, we are building evidence on the basis of which we can make informed decisions. And lastly, as an introduction to data gathering and analysis, the outcome. What do we expect? What are the immediate results we expect from gathering data and analyzing it? One is it supports transparent reporting. Transparent because this is a reflection of who we are as an organization or a department. It's just like somebody looking at himself or herself in a mirror. So what you see is the reality. And we must report the reality as it is through this data gathering and analysis. Secondly is accuracy, that data analysis and gathering should be accurate, meaning that we cannot cook any data. We report it as it is. If you have to change that data, you may have to go back afresh and collect data. And then thirdly is actionable HR audit results. Actionable because one, we have identified areas of concern or gaps. Two, we have action plans. Three, we map the person responsible and then the resources and timelines. Actionable results. That after this process, action plans should be developed and these action plans must be implemented. Anything that cannot be is not actionable. What are the types of data that we can collect related to HR? One is primary data, which can be collected through interviews or questionnaires or observations. This is information which is collected for the first time, and therefore it is first-hand information. It does not pass through a third party. So it is between the auditors and the sources. It is being collected the first time. That's why we call it primary data. Secondary data relates to any documents or records that we have in our repositories that can be used for analysis. And as such, secondary data include previous HR reports. And such reports may relate to recruitment reports, appraisal reports, training reports, or even disciplinary reports. Another secondary source is policies. Policies are guidelines. They already exist. So when we are collecting data from policies, we are looking at the gaps in policies or weaknesses, and then map that against the laws and the regulations. And then lastly is the regulatory documents, which we may have in our custody. This may include labor laws and other regulations developed by regulatory bodies. There are many regulatory bodies around us, for example, NEMA, which regulates the environment, or EPRA, which regulates energy and petroleum products. So there are many regulatory bodies that we subscribe to, and they can become handy when we have their documents and that we can look at them to ensure compliance. Another type of data is qualitative data. This is data that cannot be quantified, or you cannot put a statistical figure on it. And this relates to the opinions of the employees, which are basically expressions. You cannot quantify that. 2, culture. Culture relates to 3 things which we discussed yesterday. 1, values, 2, norms, and 3, beliefs. You cannot quantify this. You can only describe them. For example, values, the value of innovation. So we can only say an employee is innovative, but we cannot quantify their innovativeness. Unless they have brought several of them, we can say there are 3 innovations. Another non-quantifiable aspect is satisfaction. Employees can be satisfied with many things. 1, the working conditions, 2, their salaries, and 3, their jobs. We cannot quantify satisfaction unless we put that on a Likert scale, where we say highly satisfied, satisfied, and very dissatisfied. And then lastly is behavioral observations. We cannot quantify behaviors like cooperation or teamwork or timekeeping, but we can only observe them and report by way of describing them. The other type of data is quantitative data, where we are using or ratios to calculate the results. For example, payroll figures. We can extract the amount of money we pay to our employees. That is quantifiable. Or the errors made in the payroll. We can quantify that numerically. Headcount. This is the number of employees existing in each department or in the whole organization. We can conduct a head count by counting people one by one. In HR, we know how many people. In finance, we know how many people. In ICT, we know how many. So we can conduct head counts by physically counting people, and that gives us frequencies or even percentages. The other quantifiable aspect is turnover rate, where we are looking at the number of people who are leaving, and we can look at the frequency and also at a percentage. So turnover rate is a percentage. It is expected that a good turnover rate is below 15. If it's above the 15, that is a very high turnover rate, 15%. And then training statistics. This relates to the number of trainings, to the number of trainees, and also the cost of the training. These are quantifiable data. Lastly is mixed data, where we combine both non-quantitative and qualitative. And this is where we use the Likert scale, where we use very high, high, and low, and assign a weight, where very high may mean 5 and very low may mean 1, so that we have a balanced and a comprehensive audit findings. So we can have a mix of the two, both quantitative and qualitative, which can either be primary as well as secondary. Sources of audit data, quite a number of them. For those of us who have this system, you can check it out, which is Human Resource Information System. This is where we keep all our HR records related to leaves, related to recruitment, related to training, and other aspects of employment. We can always access this at any time of the day or night, and this will help us to make a determination on the frequencies or the numbers associated with various aspects of compliance. This system is very important because we can query the system and give us specific information. Unlike an open database, which is not automated, where we have to look or plow through volumes of files to get certain information. Secondly, we have employee files, which we keep in box files. This is the traditional way of doing it, that is manual, or we can have electronic personnel records, which could be inculcated or integrated in the human resource information system in bullet 1. Another source is policies and manuals. Policies are our guidelines, and I'm sure all our organizations have policies related to recruitment, to training, to performance management, grievance handling, or disciplinary procedures. These manuals provide us with the data that we are looking at, especially when we are talking about compliance as an example. If not compliance, we may have another data related to fairness, another data related to completeness, and so on. Another source is interview notes, especially during performance interviews or disciplinary interviews or recruitment interviews. People can give us insights on what is going on so that we can have a record. That becomes a source of data. Another tool or source is survey results, where we have questionnaires that have records of what happened, how, where, when, and by whom. We can put together this data, analyze it, and present findings. And lastly is external data contained in labor laws, regulations by regulatory bodies, or industry benchmark audits. The purpose of data gathering, like I mentioned from the introduction, is to ensure that we have accurate data on the basis of which we can make decisions. So specifically, the purpose of data gathering is to ensure that we have evidence in data collection. This evidence can be used to make a decision, or in case of a court case, we have a record to present. And this provides factual information to support our audit findings. Our managers usually look for evidence that when we are presenting reports, we should provide evidence. And with this evidence, we can convince managers either to support a certain recommendation or allocate resources. Another purpose is to ensure compliance. We verify compliance. For example, compliance of our policies with the labor laws, or compliance with the Constitution, or compliance with international labor standards like ILO convention. So by gathering data, we will get to verify whether our practices, our processes, or our systems are compliant. The other purpose is to help us in performance evaluations. When we gather data about the HR function, we will assess the efficiency and effectiveness of that department. Efficiency of recruitment, efficiency of training, efficiency of performance, efficiency of compensation. Effectiveness has to do with results. What results do we get from recruitment, from training, and others? Another purpose is risk identification, that when we gather data, we identify risk areas. Just like we have said, various risks may arise, either internal or external. And when we gather data internally to identify those risks. And by identifying those risks, we are able to also develop mitigation strategies. Lastly is decision support, where the data we have gathered will be used to make informed decisions. What are the methods for data collection? Whether you are doing an academic paper or conducting a HR audit, the methods are common. One, we can do a document review, where we are looking at HR policies, we are looking at contracts and other manuals. This form what we call secondary data. Secondly, we can develop questionnaires and give it to our employees or other stakeholders so that we can get their insights or opinions on HR practices. So that's another tool for data collection. Questionnaires or employee surveys. When designing this tool, please be careful to capture all the areas in terms of scope, and also ensure that it is not so long to discourage filling. If the tool is very long, people don't have time to fill it, and you may end up with an incomplete survey. Another method or tool is interviews, which is one-on-one interaction between the auditor and the employee or any other stakeholder. So through these interviews, we have a conversation where there is a question and answer method, and we get a lot of information. Where we are not clear, we can also ask probing questions. And that is the beauty of having interviews. We can collect a large amount of data. Although it is difficult to record, but it is a very good source of data. Another method is observation, where we are watching people perform certain processes or do tasks. Through observations, we are able to collect data on aspects related to recruitment, to training, to performance management, and even compensation. Another method is a human resource information system. Like I said, in the sources of data, this one here, human resource information reports. These are contained in our human resource information system. So we can extract data contained in a human resource information system, such as payroll, attendance registers, or performance data, because this is our knowledge repository related to employees. And then lastly is focus groups. In academic research, these are small groups of people, not more than 7, led by a chairperson who focus. That's why they are called focus on a particular area of interest. And they are experts. The chairperson guides the discussions. Why do we use these small groups? Because they are more experienced, knowledgeable, and have abilities to understand certain things. So through these focus groups, we can collect data, which we can use to make decisions in our data audits. And then data analysis techniques. Data analysis is about interpreting the data and making conclusions based on the findings. And in data analysis, we can use several techniques. One is trend analysis. These are changes over time. Just like we can identify trends in climate change, that at a time like now, we should be having short rains because we know those are changes that have taken place over time. But apparently we don't have rain. There is a change. And even in organizations, we can identify trends. Trends in recruitment, trends in training, trends in compensation, and trends in industrial relations or employee relations. So when we identify these trends, we are able to, one, predict the next trend or changes. And two, we are able to identify certain changes that are taking place. And therefore, data analysis helps us to identify trends. For example, in training, the trend is toward personalization, where we design programs for purposes of addressing individual training needs. We no longer want to develop programs for large groups, but we tailor-make trainings for individual needs. Another technique is ratio analysis, where, for example, we are looking at the ratio of bonuses as a percentage of the total payroll, so that we can see the proportion. Ratios show proportion, the proportion of bonuses or benefits against the payroll, so that we can have a healthy compensation and benefits system, and ensuring that our organizations do not collapse because we are giving out so much money in terms of benefits. Root cause analysis, I discussed this and said that we can use either the fishbone or the 5 whys to identify the causes of certain things. When we are making conclusions in data analysis, we usually make conclusions based on the causes. If we say that there is high rate of turnover, we must identify the causes, the direct and indirect causes. So we can have maybe compensation as a direct cause and poor management as an indirect cause. And then another data analysis technique is risk scoring, where, as I mentioned earlier, we can use a heat map. This heat map shows the likelihood and the impact. Likelihood might be high, impact might be high. And we give that 5, 5. So 5 times 5 becomes 25. That's an area that should be prioritized. And where there is green low and very low, that may be 1 times 1 is 1, and therefore we shall have scored that risk as 1 by way of weighting. We identify a weight. And then lastly is benchmarking as a technique where we are comparing our practices with others in the industry. And again, this is a common practice where we identify best practices. Then lastly, before we ask a question, is presenting audit data. Who do we present this data to? 1, the management team or board. 3, to the CEO or the board of directors, depending on our structure. So particularly, how do we present this data? We can present using dashboards. These are digital tools in our ERPs or HRIS, where we can post these reports for adoption or for review by the relevant authorities. So dashboards are digital tools. We can post our data findings there. 2, we can use narrations where we hold meetings and brief other stakeholders on our findings. The other one, especially for senior management, we give executive summaries. An executive summary is a highlight of the key findings, key risks, and the key recommendations. Why a summary? Because the senior managers do not have enough time to read all the details. What they want to have is a helicopter view of what is going on in the organization in terms of human resources. Another way of presenting is use of graphics, which is charts and graphs, where we can use charts like pie charts or bar charts. For graphs, we can use bar graphs, histograms, or line graphs. All these are acceptable ways of presenting data visually. Many of us like visual presentations because it is easy and quicker to grasp and understand the presentation. Lastly, we can present findings using frequency tables. And these tables are basically matrices which can show 2 variables at a time. And the tables, for example, gender, we can say the number of female and the number of male employees. That is a table, and then we can show the percentage if we are looking at gender representation during recruitment. These presentations have an impact on the buy-in of the people to whom we are presenting. They should be clear, they should be precise, and they should present facts as they are on the ground. Then what are the best practices in presenting audit data? 1 is accuracy. We must ensure that the data is valid, that is verifiable. We cannot afford to give assumptions. They are hard facts. 2, relevance. It must be addressing some specific aspect. Three, simplicity. The language that we use must be easy to understand. Do not use cryptic language. Or alternatively, use a language that is tailor-made for the audience. If the audience is for engineers, please use an engineering language. I don't expect you to use a HR language. If the audience is finance, use a finance language. But even then, you should be simple enough to ensure that whatever you are presenting is understood. Then another best practice is comparison, which we said is a benchmark against industry standards. So these benchmarks help us to compare ourselves with others. Where we are weaker, we borrow best practices. Where we are strong, we maintain or even do better. And then lastly, actionability. That the data we are presenting must be actionable. That suggests that we must present practical recommendations. And as I indicated earlier, an actionable data is one that shows the following. One, the area of audit. Two, the gaps. Three, the action plans. Four, the persons responsible. Five, the resources required. And six, the timelines. This will show actionability. Otherwise, without these key aspects, then the findings may not be actionable. Again, I want to invite questions or comments based on what we have covered, starting with purpose of data gathering. Two, data collection methods. Three, data analysis techniques. And four, presenting audit data. And lastly, best practices in presenting data. Any question is welcome so that we can move on. Again, in no particular order, I can shout out names. Ekiru, if you are there, please ask a question or make a comment. Charles Gitao, make your comment, ask your question. Okay. Apparently, there is no question, and that is an invitation for me to move to the next section, and that is creating an audit matrix. A matrix is a presentation in the form of a template where we are looking at the findings of our audit, the risks, the gaps, the people responsible, and the timelines. So creating an audit matrix consists of mapping risks to existing safeguards and HR policies. What is the purpose of an audit matrix? Is to guide auditors in focusing and prioritizing on those areas where there are higher risks. What is the role of an audit matrix? Is to ensure that there is a thorough review of all the HR processes, procedures, policies, and systems. What is the tool of creating this matrix? Is that it is in the form of a table which I will project, showing the risks, showing the gaps, showing the sources of the laws, and also the persons responsible up to the timelines. The outcome of this is to ensure that there is systematic and comprehensive audit evaluation, which is our main focus, comprehensive and systematic audit. What are the components of an audit matrix? And I will project this here shortly. One is the audit area, like recruitment, training, performance management, and other functions. Secondly is the standard or criteria. Here we are talking about the law, policies, or industry benchmarks, which we should be using. Thirdly, the findings. What have we found out? And these are the gaps or issues, or in some cases, the strengths and weaknesses. Then 3, risks or impacts. What are the risks related to those functions or areas of audit? For example, recruitment, what is the risk? Training, what is the risk? Performance management, what is the risk? And their consequences. Then another component in the matrix is recommendations. These are suggestions for improvement or corrective actions. Where there are gaps, like in complete policies in recruitment and selection, the recommendation could be a review of the recruitment and selection policy. And this review must have somebody responsible. So who will be responsible for the review of HR policies? It is the HR manager. And lastly, the timeline. How much time do we allow for the review of that policy, as an example? So it could be 2 months, 3 months, or 4 months. And it should be indicated in this matrix. The other component is status. That's the current position. And the status could be open. That means that it is yet to start. 2, it might be ongoing, or 3, it might have been completed. What do we do to build the matrix? 1, we should select the area, just like in the components. If I may go back, we identify the area. That is the best, that is the starting point. Select the focus area, such as recruitment or training. Then 2, list the standards. And again, when you look at the components, we look at the standards. That is the laws, the policies, and the benchmarks. Number 3, assess compliance. Identify the level of compliance between the HR policy and the law. So if it is partially compliant, we show that. If it is non-compliant, we show that. Then from there, we should gather evidence. We said gathering evidence is data collection, where we are collecting data from all sources, both within and outside. And what tools do we use? We use interviews, we use observations, we use focus groups in all the areas of audit. Then the next thing is we score the findings, especially in relation to risks. What risks? The scoring of the risks can be in 3 ways. 1, high, 2, moderate, or 3, low. And that depends on the 2 areas that, or 2 aspects that we mentioned. 1, likelihood, and 2, impact. So we can say the risk is high and we give it 5, and or the risk is low and we give it 1. And then The next thing, we make a recommendation based on the risks and the gaps identified. And again, the recommendations must be actionable, showing the area, showing the legal requirement, showing the risk, showing the person responsible, showing the timelines. That is when a recommendation can be actionable. And then what are the benefits of having an audit matrix? One is clarity. That a matrix is a very simple table that shows columns and rows, and it can be easy for us to identify the areas, the risks, the persons, and the timelines. Two, it can be easy for us to track the recommendations. And we can say the current status. Where is it? Is it open? Is it closed? Or it is yet to start? And then another benefit is that it saves on time and even cost, and therefore it's an efficient way of reporting. Another benefit is objectivity, that there are no biases. We report things as they are, giving the facts as we have found them on the ground. Comparability, we can compare among the areas that we are auditing, like recruitment, training, and others. Where do most risks arise from? And then we can compare this year by year. This year we had risks in recruitment. Next year we can compare whether the risks have come down or increased. And lastly, then it promotes transparency, where facts are given as they are and the people can see the findings in the matrix. Lastly, we will talk about challenges in creating a HR audit matrix, because in almost everything that we do, as we've said before, there are challenges. One of the challenges is complexity of putting together all the materials that will be put in this audit matrix. Again, there are so many risks that are associated with recruitment, training, performance management, and compensation. It is not an easy thing to do, and sometimes this matrix can be as long as 10 pages or even more. Much as we say that it is simple and clear, but in terms of the elements that go into it, it can be complex. Data gaps. Sometimes we have incomplete records in recruitment, in training, and other areas, and aspects of inaccuracy. And again, that becomes a challenge because these gaps may exist in documentation, but they may be addressed in the practice of things. So documents may be incomplete, but in practice, some things are working, and therefore we are in a dilemma. How are things working and when the records are incomplete? Another challenge is resource limitation, both financial and human resource, where we are saying that not all of us are qualified to conduct HR audits. It needs experience and training. Two, money. We will need money to print certain documents, need money to buy certain tools and equipment. We also need money to interview people. The other resource limitation is time. This audit is not going to take 1 day or 1 week. It can take more time. Do all the employees have the time to be audited or participate in the audit? The answer could be no, and therefore patience must be employed. The other one is changing environment. especially the labor laws are changing, the political environment is changing, technology is changing. All these changes affect audits. That what might have held to be true yesterday or existing today has changed, and that has to wait until the next audit. And lastly is subjectivity. We are all humans, and we can use our own opinions and our own experiences to interpret findings. But with the use of AI and other technologies, we should not worry about subjectivity. We can input data and ask our computers to analyze the data and present findings. Therefore, this should not be a big issue. The only challenge is when we are inputting data. We can input data based on our own personal opinions. But in terms of analysis and interpretation, data science can do that. Here is a template that I promised to project showing the audit matrix. As you can see, there are several roles which represent areas of audit and several columns. Column number 1 is the risk area, like legal compliance, recruitment and selection, or compensation and benefits. We give a description of risks where there is risk of non-compliance with the labor laws. On the recruitment, where there is a risk of unfair and biased hiring process. On compensation, there is the risk of payroll errors. And then we do a heat map where we are showing the likelihood. The likelihood for legal compliance and adherence to labor laws is medium. But when it comes to recruitment, unbiased and non-compliance, the likelihood of happening is high. And then on compensation, the likelihood of happening is medium. When we assess this under impact, it can be high, medium, or low. And then I've given there the risk level. The risk of non-compliance is high. The risk of unfair and biased recruitment is high. The risk of payroll errors is high. And therefore, because of the high level of impact, then we must prioritize. So who is the person responsible for legal compliance, especially in risk management? We can say program director. In recruitment, we have a HR manager. In benefits and compensation, we have finance and HR manager. The deadline or the timeline for labor laws, we can do it annually. For recruitment, we can do it quarterly. And for compensation, we can do it half yearly or biannually. The status for this, as you can see, for legal compliance, it's pending, meaning that it has not been started. For risk, it is ongoing. For compensation, it has been completed, meaning that the action has been taken. So that is a template that we can use to make our audit findings, particularly on risk management. Our presentation today was risk management. So ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our presentation this afternoon. I will now ask any one of us who has a question or a comment to make for purposes of seeking clarification. Frida, if you have a question, please go ahead and ask or make your comment. Charles Gitau, if you are there, go ahead. Benjamin?
Thank you, Malim. I think that table is very, very important for us, especially
Yes.
some of us who are in HR. We will use that table to map out the risks that they are in our offices or in HR. Yeah.
Thank you, Benjamin. Charles, I can see you.
Hello.
Yes, Charles.
Good
Ask your
evening.
question or make your comment. Good evening. How are you?
I'm fine. Sorry,
Yes.
I've been very quiet, but I'm following very keenly.
That's very important.
Yeah, the presentation had been so good for me.
Yes.
And I'm now well off with the HR audits.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It is very good. You have done it very well.
Thank you, Charles, and I'm happy that you are happy with the presentation. I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Please don't miss. And also don't miss the HR audit for certification on the 20th to the 25th of this month at Nairobi Safari Club. Anybody else with a question or a comment to make? Okay. There being no other questions or comments to make, I want to thank you very much for attending this afternoon session. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for listening. I will hope to see you again tomorrow morning. Please don't miss. Our session starts at 9 to 12. Thank you.